I'm Noah Williams. I'm the director of the Center for Research on the Wisconsin Economy here at UW-Madison. Happy to join you. We started the center about 3 years ago this fall. Its focus is on economics and economic policy with a particular focus on the state level. With this webinar series, we're looking at impacts on the state, but also branching out, of course, because it's a key time for the nation and for the with the election upcoming. In fact, as we sit here, we're now 36 days out until the November 3rd election. Voting is already underway in a number of places. In particular, here in Madison, there was just an event over the weekend collecting absentee ballots in the city parks. Wisconsin, in particular, has played an important role in the 2016 election and has been a focus for both political parties since that time, and particularly now as we head into the home stretch of the election. Our timing is also auspicious in that there is a presidential debate tomorrow night, and one of the topics of the debate is the economy. And of course, many of the other topics that they do touch on will have economic aspects to them. So tonight we're going to discuss in broad terms kind of where we are in the US economy, where we've been, and how would the election potentially impact on where we'll be going in the future. Just to give a brief sense of where we are, I mean, I think it's probably useful to think of the past 4 years to break it down into, what happened up until about March and then what's happened since then. For example, just a couple of statistics, and we'll delve into more detail throughout. From 2017 through 2019, the US economy averaged about 2.5% GDP growth. The beginning of 2020, first quarter, GDP growth contracted by 5% at an annual rate. And then in the second quarter, nearly 32% at an annual rate. Of course, this was all a consequence of the COVID-19 pandemic and the shutdowns and all the economic disruption which resulted. Similarly, the unemployment rate in February stood at 3.5%, and fallen sort of continually really since the end of the Great Recession, but then skyrocketed and peaked at 14.7% in April, and then has come down significantly since then, but it still remains at a relatively elevated 8.4%. Of course, underlying these aggregate numbers are considerable change at the micro level. Over the past 4 years, but even going beyond that, we've seen significant changes in inequality. Changes at the micro level, increases in healthcare costs, perhaps limitations, expansions, but also some limitations in healthcare access, fast changes in education, the cost of education, and something I'm sure all of you or many of you in the audience are facing. So these are some of the topics which we're going to get into tonight with our speakers. I will introduce them in just one sec. Before doing so, I want to advertise next week on Tuesday. We'll be having another webinar where we'll be focusing in more detail on fiscal policy, and that will be with Brian Riedel from the Manhattan Institute, who is actually a UW-Madison economics alumnus. Then on the following Tuesday, October 13th, we will be having a webinar with Casey Mulligan, talking about the economic record of the Trump administration. Casey served as chief economist of the Council of Economic Advisors in 2018. So tonight is, again, the first in the series. We're looking at economic issues in 2020 and beyond. We're going to be talking in broad terms about, again, where we are and where we've been. And with that, let me introduce our speakers. First, Diane Whitmore Schonzenbach. Diane is director of the Institute for Policy Research and the Margaret Walker Alexander Professor of Human Development and Social Policy at Northwestern. She studies policies aimed at improving the lives of children in poverty, including healthcare education, and income support policies. Much of her recent work has focused on major public policies and social policy, as well as early childhood education and the effect of early childhood education on long-term outcomes. She's testified on her research before both houses of Congress, and from 2015 through 2017, she served as the director of the Hamilton Project at Brookings. Thanks for joining us, Diane.
Thanks, Noah.
Our other speaker is Lee Ohanian. Lee is a professor of economics and director of the Edinger Family Program in Macroeconomic Research at UCLA, as well as a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. Lee's research focuses on economic crises, economic growth, and the impact of public policy on the economy. He's a frequent contributor for many outlets, including the Wall Street Journal, San Francisco Chronicle, and other media, as well as writing a, I believe it's monthly column for the Hoover Institution website.
It's supposed to be weekly, but I miss one or two here and there.
All right, let's say a regular column. He is also the director for the Center for the Advanced Study of Economic Efficiency at Arizona State. He's been an economic advisor to numerous state and national campaigns, and has also testified before the U.S. Senate and California State Legislative Assembly. Thanks for joining us, Lee. So we're going to start. I gave the speakers the same basic question, which is really quite broad, to kick things off. In terms of division of labor by expertise, suggested that Lee would focus more on macro issues, Diane more on micro. So we'll start with the big picture, and then we'll zoom in a little bit. So we'll start with Lee. And the first question, before we get going, if anyone has questions along the way, type them into the chat. We'll be having a Q&A session at the end. Meant to mention that. Also joining us are some of my colleagues here from CROWE, who are free to jump in with questions of their own, but also we'll read off the questions from the chat when we get there. So the broad opening question is, what do you think are the major economic issues that we're facing now, and how would they be impacted by the election? And first up to take this is Lee. So take it away.
Great. Noah, is it okay if I share a screen with some slides?
Yes, I think we should be set up to do that. Yeah.
Great.
I know. Elizabeth also had them loaded. So.
Great. Okay. Should I go all the way through these, or pause?
I don't know how long it would take to go.
Yeah, we'll interrupt you if you interrupt it.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, why don't you, take some time and just kind of lay things out in broad terms.
Okay, great. All right, I'll go through these quickly. So anyway, thanks so much for having me. So we flipped a coin, and I think I came away with being the optimist, and Diane was going to be the pessimist. So I'm going to approach this with the idea that we'll be getting past the pandemic before too long, and then I'll focus my remarks primarily on the national economy, and then some remarks about Wisconsin, but really with the focus about what happens as we recover from the pandemic. And the main points I'll make, throughout our session is that policies that support growth and to support competition can support a strong recovery. Areas where we need to, I think, make some improvements are in the areas of investments, both human investments and physical capital investments, and address fiscal issues that are becoming problematic for the U.S. government. So in terms of where we were before the pandemic, I'll just follow up a bit on what Noel mentioned, is that a lot of indicators were looking really good. GDP, employment, net worth, productivity, these were all growing significantly. Here's a picture of real GDP per person from about the last 50 years. And you see the fall off the cliff right here with the pandemic, but what you really notice otherwise is really very, very substantial economic growth. And the U.S. is the only country in the world that's enjoyed this long run trend growth for the last roughly 250 years. So it's really a remarkable economic success story. You see here in terms of this graph, this shows employment in the U.S. as a share of the working age population, but the last 50 years. So again, you see the drop off the cliff here with the pandemic, but then thinking forward about where we might go, you see the strong job gains that we had after the financial crisis. So we were recovering really nicely in terms of employment. Here's Wisconsin. Wisconsin non-farm employment looks, not surprisingly, very similar to the pattern we see for the U.S. Again, big drop with the pandemic, but you saw Wisconsin adding jobs really substantially after the financial crisis, and in percentage terms more strongly than the rest of the country. So Wisconsin was doing comparatively well. This is worker productivity, real output per hour from the last 50 years. And this is how the U.S. has become so prosperous. So we have an economy that, absent from the pandemic, is creating about $21 trillion of output per year, and it's because our workers are so remarkably productive. This is an index, so you can see that our workers today are roughly 2.5 times as productive as our counterparts 50 years ago. This is a chart you don't see very often, but it's an important one from the standpoint of people being able to retire, people being able to purchase homes, and this is median real household net worth. And what really struck me about this graph is that median inflation-adjusted net worth didn't really change a whole lot between 2015 and, say, 1995. There's some ups and downs, but it wasn't really going anywhere. But with the stock market really taking off and small businesses being valued more highly, we see a substantial increase in median household net worth. So these are really all positives thinking ahead to after the pandemic. What about room for improvement? So I mentioned investments in people and in education. This screen is the share of GDP devoted to investment in plant and equipment. And you can see that we had come back from the financial crisis, but not to the levels that we were at on average, say, in the 1980s. And in my opinion, the corporate tax change we had in 2018 is supporting more investment. Most of our theories suggest that investment returns should be taxed at a fairly low rate. So we did see some improvement here. I think more improvement is something we'd like to see. And then I'll kind of close out, and I'm sure Diane will follow us up because she's really a specialist in the area of education, is concerns I have about K through 12 in the United States, in particular in the STEM areas, math and science. And the Program for International Student Achievement, that's this thing called PISA, okay? That's an international comparison test that's given to students around the world. And our kids don't grade out as well as I think they could. So our students perform far below the top performers. They're way behind kids in China, parts of China, and Singapore. Our kids also test lower in math and science behind peer countries such as Canada, Finland, the UK, Sweden, Germany, and France. And they also test below countries that don't have the resources we have to devote to education. Countries like Estonia, Poland, Russia, the Slovak Republic. Kids in those countries score at a higher rate than our kids. If you're thinking about Wisconsin, okay, Wisconsin comes in 14th in K through 12. So Wisconsin's doing a comparatively pretty good job. And as we get into this, we might have time to talk about potential reforms that may have to do with how we pay teachers. The best teachers are incredibly valuable, and we may want to consider reforms to how they're paid and how teacher tenure is handled. The last thing I'll mention, sorry about taking up so much time, is our fiscal house. So this chart shows federal deficits as a percent of GDP from 2020 out to 2050. These are projections performed by the Congressional Budget Office. And because of federal support of the pandemic, we see a horrendous deficit of about minus 16% this year. And that is a number that you typically never see unless it's a war, such as World War II. The CBO is anticipating this is not going to last much longer, which would recover to a deficit about minus 4%. But after that, it continues to head down because of issues associated with demographics, more people retiring, more people going on Medicare, and fewer people working to support those populations. If you're interested in federal debt as a percent of GDP, well, we used to be at around 30% before the financial crisis. We spent a lot during the financial crisis to try to backstop communities and states and support the economy. We went from about 32% up to 70% pretty quickly. Now we're up to 100%, and the CBO projects that we'll be close to 200% if no changes are made to policies out by 2050. And this is dangerous territory. Empirically speaking, that's not something we want to do. We haven't seen a number such as 100% since World War II, when the war was just incredibly costly. Okay, I'll stop there.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot. That was a good opening. All right, Diane, your turn. Same basic question.
Fantastic. Well, Lee stole a bit of my thunder at the beginning, and so did you, Noah. I mean, things were great prior to COVID. We had the longest employment expansion on record, a very low unemployment rate in February, 3.5%. And it is important to note that full employment brings a lot of good things to families, to the poor, to children, et cetera. In 2019, we had the lowest poverty rate on record at 10.5%. Food insecurity, which is a measure of whether families have enough money to buy the food that they need, sort of another cut at poverty, was also the lowest on record. And incomes were growing. Median incomes were up nearly 7% year over year between 2018 and 2019. They were up for every single subgroup, for Blacks, for whites, for Hispanics. Median earnings were up, et cetera, et cetera. We had been quite concerned in the wake of the Great Recession about declining labor force participation rates, and that had reversed its negative trend. And that brings a lot of good to families, not just for the income that it brings, but for sort of the order that it brings to have, parents engaged in employment. So lots and lots of good news on the eve of COVID. One thing that should cause some worry is that the share of people without health insurance coverage has been ticking up a little bit, and that sort of requires some constant monitoring. But things were great, and then in comes COVID. I just have a few slides that I will do my best to share. There we go. Let's see. Yeah, do we get it? There we go. So of course, what this shows is the percent change in unemployment rates. And of course, the unemployment rate jumped to nearly 15% in April. This recession is shown here in purple. We at Northwestern don't usually like to show bad things in purple, but I'm going to make an exception in this case. And this compares to declines in the unemployment rate in other recent recessions. If you remember, a little over a decade ago when we hit the Great Recession, which is this in blue, we thought it was terrible. It was, the worst recession that we'd seen since the Great Depression. And unemployment bottomed out, very low compared to other recent recessions, and took a long time to get to this place that we were on the eve of COVID. And then you can compare, what this COVID recession looks like. There's been, as you know, a lot of debate, are we going to see a Nike swoosh recession or a checkmark recession, or what exactly is this going to look like? And there are some things that are different about this recession, but there are many things that probably are likely to be similar, including that low-income families experience higher increases in unemployment, and it takes them longer to recover after the economy starts turning around. So I think it is a fair prediction to think that especially low-income families, Black and Latinx families, are going to be experiencing high and elevated rates of unemployment for years. And that is going to, bring with it all sorts of other areas of distress. So a little bit more about what we know during COVID. Measures of acute economic distress have been up substantially. I think the best estimates suggest that food insecurity has essentially doubled, maybe even tripled among households with children. Many people have seen the reports, the news reports of long lines at food banks. Demand at food banks nationwide essentially doubled and has gone up even more than that in some places. Now, of course, none of these data are perfect. Taking surveys during a pandemic is difficult. We know that there was some mismeasurement in the unemployment rate, and it will take us years. It will give at least economists full employment to sort out really what's the extent of this over time. Something else that's been special about this recession that we haven't seen before is that it's hit women's employment more than it has men's employment. Never happened before. And that particularly matters for kids because many, many children in this country live with single working moms. And so they're sort of even more vulnerable right now, not to mention, of course, the school closures. So it's important to make this recession that we're facing now as short-lived as possible. And at the beginning, I would argue that Congress did, a real stand-up job in responding to this. So they started with the unemployment insurance top-up with that extra $600 a week. They also introduced a new unemployment insurance program to cover people who are gig workers or are sort of outside of the usual UI system, and kudos to places that were able to get that up and running quickly in the midst of a pandemic. Congress also very quickly made some smart reforms to SNAP, which is formerly known as the food stamp program. They're vouchers so low-income families can buy groceries at the grocery store. Now everyone is getting the maximum SNAP allotment, which is about $35 per person per week. And so some people didn't previously get maximum benefits, and so they've sort of experienced a bump. They also made some smart temporary administrative changes, introduced a new program that makes up for missed school meals, providing additional benefits to families, and of course the stimulus payment. So many people are sort of wondering, if we've done this historic response, why then is there still so much need? I recently, with Hillary Hoynes and Marion Bittler, wrote a paper for Brookings that tried to explore this in more detail, and I'm happy to unpack it more later, but we think it comes down to three issues. The first was delays in payments, especially in those early days when everyone was flooding the unemployment insurance system at the same time. There were just delays, backlogs, they had to get the new pandemic unemployment insurance system up. And so that meant that, many families really struggled, to pay their rent, to buy the food that they needed until they, got these benefits. So the delays in payments, I think, really hurt low-income families, but much of that has been worked out. The second is, aside from that $600 top-up, many of the increased benefits have been modest, especially given the length of the distress that we're facing here. And in particular, because a lot of families didn't become unemployed, but lost hours at work or lost gigs if they're sort of in the gig economy. In most states, they're not eligible for unemployment insurance if there's not a partial UI system. So they are basically underinsured for this negative shock that they've faced. And then the third is just holes in coverage. There are many people who are not traditionally eligible for unemployment insurance. It will take some time to figure out, what percentage of people are we covering now. The data are just puzzling to everybody. It's the Wild West right now. So then, of course, as of August 1st, the $600 UI top-up has been sunset, and we might want to understand, what's happened since then. Has that made things worse? Have things gotten better? What exactly? I would argue that it's hard to tell for sure. The economy has recovered more quickly than we expected it to, I think, than certainly the CBO initially projected. So, so we've seen the unemployment rate, it's still quite elevated, but it's down to 8.4%. And so that is bringing lots of good along with it. But I think that the data right now are indicating sort of a bimodal recovery. There's some evidence sort of coming out of Raj Chetty's shop that high earners who are able to work at home have basically seen essentially a full recovery. They're earning plenty, and in fact, they're saving money because they can't go out to restaurants, and there are these sort of normal places to spend. But on the other hand, I think that there's evidence that many of the lower income families are really struggling here. So there's numbers on child hunger, food insecurity, adult hunger right now that are just off the charts, and I would just argue unconscionable right now. I will show this is what food insecurity looks like in Wisconsin and the United States overall, and then your sort of struggling neighbor to the south here in Illinois. You can see that Wisconsin actually is doing pretty well on a lot of these metrics. Their food insecurity is lower, certainly than the US average, and also still than Illinois. Nonetheless, we are quite concerned about this, so I'll stop the share. Just a few things to end on. To their great credit, Congress finally extended this food program for kids to continue to provide food resources for missed school meals. I would argue, I think that there's broad consensus. I'll be curious if either of you disagree that we're not going to see really a full recovery here until the virus gets controlled. That a lot of what's holding back the economy is people not being willing to spend because they can't go out, et cetera. So we need to get the virus under control. It's unclear, I think we're all sort of reading the same news stories about, when's that going to come, when's that going to come. But the very last piece that I want to leave this on is that the impact on children of this COVID recession is going to be with us for decades. The lost education, that is being missed right now because of online learning and sort of the holes in that are going to cause great damage all across the distribution. It's not just poor kids that are going to be hurt, rich kids are too. I think there's good evidence that it's very difficult, if not impossible, to make up this loss at scale. And so that just underscores the need to make this as short as possible. And frankly, to treat the fact that kids are not in school like the emergency that it is. That's where I'll end.
Okay, great. Thank you. So that was very informative on both counts. So I would now kind of encourage, we're going to have a little bit more of a free-form discussion here, I think would be more interesting. One question to kind of lead things off, I think, Diane, you did a good job of talking about current policy. One question kind of for both of you, talked about, how good things were before the COVID pandemic. How much of that can we attribute to policy? What would potentially change going forward? Kind of into, again, trying to think about where, the theme of the webinar, sort of how much has policy mattered, up through, say, the beginning of the year, and what could potentially change going forward? I don't know who, if Diane, if you want to take that first, and then we'll go back to Lee.
Yeah, I mean, certainly policy matters. I think we all agree on that. I think it seems evident that Lee and I probably have some different specific policy preferences, but sort of within sort of a broad range that is pro-market. It's investing in fundamentals of economic productivity. For example, building human capital, which Lee sort of ended with, when we don't do a great job, even when the economy is great, at making sure that people are learning and building the human capital that we need them to. And I agree with that. And so when I was at the Hamilton Project, we spent a lot of time, trying to think about how to equip everyone to participate in broad-based economic growth. And, to my mind, a lot of that comes down to, high quality human capital in terms of education and health.
Yeah, I agree with Diane's comment there, and where I was going with the slides I had was related to, our really, I mean, I'm going to call them deficiencies in this country for how well we're teaching our kids at K through 12. Particularly, there's a bit of a have and have not aspect to that. There's some families who can afford to live in areas that have really high performing public schools or who attend exceptional private schools. And there's others further down the income scale who don't have those opportunities. So there's a lot of research in that area that all sort of points, I think, a lot coming from people as different as Raj Chetty at Harvard and Rick Hanishek at Stanford, about how some, I think, relatively common sense reforms that are related to teacher union collective bargaining agreements can promote better efficiency, which include merit-based pay. A lot of teacher salaries are set on the basis of seniority. Specialists oftentimes aren't treated differently than teachers who aren't specialists. So when it comes time to say Chicago's going to hire a math specialist, good luck in doing that, because they're not going to pay that person a competitive salary. Someone who knows math, who really knows how to teach math, they're going to be expensive. They're worth it, but they probably aren't going to get hired because the collective bargaining agreement doesn't provide for that type of salary. We do a great job in post-secondary education. There's no country that comes close to the United States in terms of universities. And then just follow up on Diane's point about productivity. The reason the U.S. has been so successful for so long is because we've had this just continuous flow of kind of game-changing startups. So back in, once upon a time, GM and U.S. Steel were those game-changing startups. And nothing lasts forever, and those companies got very big and stopped innovating at the same level they had. And then IBM and General Electric picked up after that, and those companies slowed down. And now we have companies like Apple and Google and Microsoft and Facebook that are creating enormous economic value. And what we really need to worry about is who are going to be the Amazons and the Facebooks and the Googles of tomorrow. So from that perspective, a lot of our transformational companies come from immigrants. So highly skilled, remarkably innovative and creative immigrants would like to be in the United States. And we should be welcoming them with open arms, because, you throw a seed out there and then 1 out of 10,000 of those seeds is going to be something remarkable and change our lives. So we want as many super high creative, innovative people as we can get, because new business formation is absolutely vital and critical for being able to grow the economy in the long run.
I'll add to that how important it is that we continue to preserve small businesses and businesses sort of in general. I talked a lot about the relief payments that were aimed at families, but Congress has also done, I think, some really important work trying to preserve businesses, because while we weather this storm, if at the same time we basically break our infrastructure by letting lots of companies go bankrupt, that's going to prolong this problem. So Congress has been doing a good job, but I just am very concerned that they keep wanting to take their foot off the gas.
Yeah, I think the prospects for further further help seem fairly dim at this point. I don't know if you I would imagine you agree on that end. So you both kind of touched on education. I mean, I think Lee in particular mentioned sort of teacher pay, perhaps school choice. I mean, I do want to say Wisconsin, of course, one of the fundamental reforms of the past decade was the Act 10 reform, eliminating basically public sector unions, teachers unions, or a lot of the regulations around them. There's actually been some work showing that some of the flexibility that allowed, in particular, some districts did implement more performance-based pay. Barbara Biasi had a great paper on that, showing that actually had a significant response in terms of educational attainment. So I wanted to throw that out there. As long as we're kind of in the education space, a lot of the discussion with post-secondary education revolves around tuition costs, student debt. I don't know if you. First, is that as big an issue as perhaps some people make it out to be? And if so, or if not, is there anything that policy should consider along those lines?
Yes, I love to take that on. I want to just one quick rebuttal to remind you that it's not, teachers are not the only public sector union that have pernicious side effects. My favorite economist, who's a guy named Max Schonzenbach, does a lot of work on police unions. And in fact, I think Wisconsin did not have a broad public sector reform in terms of unions. It was really aimed towards teachers, and we should be thinking maybe more broadly about that. So with that point, I'll turn to, you raise a great question. A lot of attention gets paid to costs of higher education. Even at the very high sticker prices at some of the the most elite places, still finishing a college degree is the most it's going to give you the best payoff of any investment that you make. College is very, very much worthwhile. Even and especially right now, when your alternative use of your labor market has declined, right? We're seeing a lot of people take a year off, a gap year, something like that, to do what instead of go to college. I get that Zoom isn't the most interactive way to take, your first or second year in college, but when you think about the opportunity cost and how much that's declined right now, I've been giving everyone the advice to stick with it, finish up your degree, and you're going to have a long career ahead of you, but don't delay, for an extra year. So I think the evidence is unmistakable that a college education is well worth it. You can get into a little bit of trouble if you start a college education and don't finish it. To be sure, there's variation across majors and return to majors. In fact, when I was at the Hamilton Project, we did a lot of work to try to just liberate that information and make it evident to students who are thinking about different majors. What do trajectories of earnings look like if I decide to major in economics versus engineering versus English literature. I think we all like for people to make informed decisions in this, but on average, without question, even at very high prices, college education is worth it. Oh, and then related to that, there's a lot of attention on student loans. There is, to be sure, a wide distribution in the amounts of student loans. I just read a paper today that shows, median student loan debt among borrowers is still something like $20,000. A large sum, to be sure, but more than outweighed by the benefits that you receive from that college education.
Okay, great. Yeah, I don't know if you have anything on that. And then following this, I'm also going to invite my colleagues to jump in with some of their own questions, and some we're getting some from the chat as well.
Sure.
So, but Lee, if you want to say something quick.
Yeah, I agree with Dan's point. The premium that's associated in terms of lifetime earnings that comes with a college degree is enormous. It's increased, it was high 30 years ago, and it's increased 35% since that time. That said, the university system, which we all work in, is a little bit of a cartel. There's not an enormous amount of entry into that business model, although online education has become more accessible. And Arizona State really is one of the leaders in that area. But it's expensive. Students can save an awful lot by going to community college for 2 years and then transferring to university. An awful lot of people at UCLA do that. UCLA is one of the hardest schools to get into as a freshman. It's actually a little bit of a secret. It's actually pretty easy to get into when you're a junior. So there is some flexibility there. But yeah, the premium really has never been higher. And and we would, not that everybody needs to go to college, but certainly there is just increasing complementarity between skills and all the amazing new software and capital that's being created. And that I don't see that slowing down.
Okay, great. I don't know if Kim or Simeon want to jump in with a question or one of their own or one from the chat.
Sure. I'm going to summarize a few questions that have come up in the chat room into kind of one big question, which seems to have a lot. There's been several questions now about the federal debt, the U.S. debt levels. Lee mentioned that they're quite large now. And to the extent that interest rates are low, to the extent that the U.S. Credit rating isn't changing. Everybody, or you both, have talked about the importance of the federal programs that have propped up the economy and maybe what they're going to have to do in the future. How should we think about that trade-off between the two? I mean, certainly the debt levels seem concerning. How do we think about that question?
Yeah, no, I saw some of the questions coming in from Ananth and some of your colleagues. Yes, so my spin on this, and I think there's a lot of room. I think it's an open question, but every country has a tipping point. What's involved with that tipping point when interest rates skyrocket and governments have a hard time repaying? We've seen so many episodes like this. We saw what happened in Greece about 10 years ago. Greece had an incredibly weak economy, yet they were able to borrow for just under 5% month after month, year after year. And then in about a 4-month period, interest rates on Greek debt went from 5% to 10%. Another 8 months or a year after that, they were at 30%. So a lot of bad dynamics happen when investors start worrying about the ability of a government to repudiate its debt or not be able to pay it back, or partially repudiate with inflation. And there's really a vicious circle that goes on with investors begin to worry, interest rates go up. Interest rates going up means interest costs go up, particularly if a government is relying on short-term debt as having to roll over, which has really got what got Mexico in trouble in the mid-1990s. They were borrowing heavily at short-term rates, and when short-term rates went up, they got to the point where they really couldn't roll it over anymore. The U.S. is benefiting enormously right now because the U.S. is still, despite we have huge deficits and 100% debt to GDP ratio, the U.S. is still perceived to be the safest country in the world to invest in. So we're able to borrow at these remarkably low rates. And I just refinanced my mortgage, so I'm a beneficiary of that. If the U.S. were to lose its safe haven position, then I would be concerned. One thing, economists, we have a hard time predicting what that tipping point will be. What we know is that when investors start getting worried, things can change just remarkably quickly, such as we saw in Greece 10 years ago. So we don't know, is it 150% debt to GDP or 180% or 130%? But I do think that responsible policy would address the demographic issues we're confronting as the baby boom generation begins to retire. They start accessing Social Security, they start accessing medical care to a greater extent. And I see no reason why we can't begin to have those discussions and start making some progress on that. Not to be too partisan, I think both parties are to blame here, but it's been a long, long time since any politician has said, hey, we have a demographic train wreck coming towards us. We really have to resolve some issues regarding Medicare and Social Security. It's not in the political interest of politicians to say that now the way things work, so they're happy to go about not talking about it until they're forced to. I don't know when they're going to be forced to do that, but I think we'll be better off if we do that sooner rather than later. We don't have to do it tomorrow or next month or 6 months from now, but sooner is better than later. I know not to ask a question about World War II. Interestingly, in World War II, the Federal Reserve managed interest rates at 0.3% on short-term debt, and I believe maybe 0.7% on long-term debt. That was a time when capital markets were just so remarkably different. Debt to GDP would have been much, much worse had they not been able to do that. We haven't talked about the Fed, but I do worry about central bank independence and that central banks around the world might be being asked to do more than can reasonably be expected of them. So anyway, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I agree with much of that. I think Lee sort of danced around it a little bit. I think that we do not need to worry today or tomorrow about the debt. I think we need to get out of this current crisis. And, to my eye, that's probably going to involve some more spending. But my preference, and this is sort of policy preferences of mine, would be to see that targeted and temporary. I'd love to see Congress sort of use some of the lessons, draw on some of the lessons learned from the Great Recession and use, some of those same tools. Instead of, I think to date, they've been sort of spending more broadly, certainly less targeted than I wish it would be. And I agree wholeheartedly that we need for Congress to act like adults and take on this very serious long-term fiscal challenges that we have, largely due to entitlement programs. I would commend to you all, Bill Gale at the Brookings Institution wrote a very fine book last year around this time, I think it was released, where he laid out a plan that I think could garner quite a lot of bipartisan agreement about how to face this and sort of bend that cost curve around entitlements. I think everyone understands that no single person in Congress, will want to champion this. And so we'll probably need, a serious panel of experts, sort of coming together, horse trading, and sort of providing some sort of a plan that is either sort of an up or down vote. But this is hard work to do, but we, desperately need to be taking it seriously, for our kids and for our grandkids.
Okay, so here's another kind of roundup of a question. So there's been a few questions now about firm creation and kind of business dynamism. There were kind of questions about about business formation slowing before this recession. The sense that this recession, or often we think about recessions as being a time of creative destruction, that the weakest firms close and the strongest ones survive, and that's part of how we recover from something like this. This has had this kind of strange set of policies where many firms aren't allowed to compete at all. Some people ask questions about, could there be kind of zombie firms that are being propped up by government loans? That's been asked about in the chat room. Would you guys like to maybe address that and maybe what that might mean for the recovery, for inequality, for I imagine a whole host of issues?
Yeah, the U.S. economy really, its hallmark has been one of remarkable reallocation of resources across industries, across firms within an industry. The Bureau of Labor Statistics, but the last 20 years or so, has been compiling a database of job creation, job destruction. And it's just remarkable how much of that goes on behind the scenes. We look at employment reports where, right now is kind of a weird time, but in a normal period, we would see maybe 200,000 people. There's net creation of 200,000 jobs in a month. Behind the scenes, there's a factor of 10 or 15 change as people leave one business, go to another, or one industry, go to another. And that's been a big part of U.S. growth. I was really concerned 10 years ago when the startup rate, just really abysmally dropped. It has recovered a bit. It's not it's not where it was in the 1980s or 1990s. Things that can support that, I mentioned high school immigration. I mentioned improvements in education. That is a very slow boat, just by its nature. But I've talked to small business owners. They just tell me how difficult it is to find workers who they would call, qualified. What qualified means is different to every person who runs a business. But they talk about skilled labor shortages. They talk about difficulties getting financing. So these are some things that policies can improve upon. I see a lot of good reasons why this can get better once we get past the pandemic, given the kinds of improvements we're seeing in these statistics in the last couple of years.
I'd maybe add to that, for sure, there are probably some zombie firms that should be going out of business that might be propped up during this, but the extent of the devastation is so large that I think more good will be done than harm with this sort of influx of resources. But of course, that's another thing where we'll be fighting about that for the next decade, and hopefully we'll have some better evidence the next time we face something.
Yeah, just one postscript. I mean, Japan suffered by almost just unquestionably keeping businesses afloat. And there's work by Ed Prescott and Fumi Hayashi who talked about, and many follow-up papers about Japan's lost decade. And in those sets of papers, they talked about subsidization of businesses that probably just are no longer competitive, but they're able to get preferential lending arrangements. To my knowledge, China is now a great example of this, where there's still large state-owned enterprises that are able to access capital at very, very favorable rates. But if you're a private enterprise, good luck in getting a loan at an interest rate anything close to what the SOEs get. So yeah, this is an important issue. We haven't done that nearly as much here in the U.S. As in those other countries.
Right, I'm going to jump in with one question here because I saw one from my friend Buckley Brinkman, who actually he's the CEO of the Wisconsin Center for Manufacturing and Productivity. As you probably know, manufacturing is a key industry in Wisconsin, and it also is, politically salient. President Trump certainly made a point of talking about reshoring of manufacturing. Vice President Biden also talks a lot about kind of the Made in America agenda. So I was wondering, this is kind of a two-part question. First, Buckley's specific question was, what kind of role does manufacturing and traditional industries play in sort of helping us come out of the recovery? But I also wanted to expand that a little bit to think about, we haven't talked about trade at all, which has, of course, been one of the key economic policy debates over the last 4 years. So if you could touch on trade, which also ties in very closely with manufacturing.
Sure. I was happy to see NAFTA addressed, recently. Aside from issues about globalization, NAFTA was a treaty that just technologically was old. That treaty was signed at a time when hardly anybody even knew what the internet was. 1 in 4 American households had a personal computer. So all sorts of things in commerce have changed since that time. Let me just come back to that just one second. In terms of manufacturing, obviously the gentleman knows in his position that what's happened to the manufacturing job base in the country, but he also knows, and I'm sure other listeners know that the value of U.S. manufacturing jobs is skyrocketing. So the manufacturing base has really switched to what I would call specialty manufacturing, where worker value added is just super high. In California, where I live, there's a relatively small manufacturing base, but it's all in incredibly high value jobs. So I see that as an outgrowth of innovation and R&D that we probably can do more to support from a policy perspective. And those seem like the natural areas for us to engage in and to expand in. There was a period of time where people really worried, is our U.S. manufacturing jobs going to disappear? Well, No, but as the cost structure of producing different goods changes across countries and over time, we're going to lose some areas of production and we're going to gain others. And just to get back to trade, when the president imposed tariffs on China in particular, I was really worried about that, just from the reason that 99% of economists are worried about imposing trade barriers. We'll see what happens after the pandemic, but the president has reached in principle agreements with China about opening China up, and I'm happy to see that. China would benefit enormously from having access to more American goods. It's complicated for intellectual property reasons and so forth, but I'm optimistic from a global perspective. American workers are the highest value-added workers in the world, and there's no reason why we can't compete with anyone.
Okay.
Sorry if I can jump in for a moment here. I'm going to actually aggregate a couple of questions that have come up related to healthcare, and they kind of boil down to sort of the broad question, which is the pandemic has really sort of laid bare some of the structural issues in the U.S. healthcare system, everything from actually providing care, but also maybe the way we deliver insurance coverage. I think the gist of the 2 or 3 questions that have come up on the message board is this an opportunity to sort of review our health policy, our infrastructure, the way to deliver, we certainly deliver top-notch sort of cutting-edge care, but it's not so clear that we have a solid sort of framework for delivering basic care and public health services. So it's a very open-ended question, but is there something that, maybe we can sort of fold into this question about what are short-term policies to get us out of this, meaning how do we keep everyone healthy versus what's going to lay the groundwork, so to speak, for future growth, specifically, not only, but also with the fiscal house in mind.
So I think the part of that I'm sort of maybe best equipped to answer is, one thing that's I think really highlighted is how much in terms of benefits, both in terms of health benefits and other income support benefits, are tied to employment in this country. And I think that is a policy that works reasonably well for us when we're in an economic expansion. So, prior to COVID, we were talking a lot about, let's tie Medicaid eligibility to work, or let's, increase work requirements on SNAP. But I think one thing that this pandemic has really laid bare is something that I've been yelling about for years, which is, we have a safety net, both in terms of health and income support, that's tied to work, and people are underinsured when the economy turns south. There are many, many holes in the unemployment insurance system. That's why we saw that Congress had to add the $600. So I think top on my list would be to really think about how to improve that safety net, again, both in terms of health and other aspects, to respond better to economic downturns. That's been something that we've known for quite some time, and hopefully we'll have the will this time to do something.
Yeah, just to follow up on that. So I agree with Diane. And what I think what we would all like to see is stop seeing so many resources used for outcomes that just end up not being worth that amount of resources being paid. So I think at a broad level, we need to incentivize the consumers of healthcare to economize as much as they can on healthcare. So I'd love to see pricing transparency. Hospitals hate this. There's actually a group of doctors in Oklahoma, and now the name of the clinic escapes me, but they broke away from a hospital, and they run their own shop. There's orthopedics, there's nephrology, there's dermatology, all the specialties are there, and they just transparently advertise their prices, and all the hospitals in the area just hate it. Because and that's just something that shouldn't happen in a market economy, and we don't have a true market for healthcare. I think that's one of the real problems that we face. So I don't know, cross our fingers that we can do better, and we should be able to do better. So we'll see.
All right, well, we have hit the 8 o'clock hour. I told both speakers that we would take 1 hour, so we could easily go on for another couple of hours. There's a number of questions which came up in the chat and a number of other topics which we haven't touched on, but I think we'll have to leave those for another time. And I want to thank again both speakers for participating. So thank you, Diane and Lee. And thank you for everyone tuning in. Again, just a reminder, the next webinar will be next week, but it'll be on Tuesday evening, where we'll go a little bit more into detail on fiscal policy, debt, and the government budget with Brian Riedel. So thank you, everyone, and have a good evening, and we'll hope to see you again here soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Lee. Thanks, Diane.